السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والحمد لله رب العالمين، وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، له الحمد وله الشكر. واللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى محمد، خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين، المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان ليوم الدين. اللهم يا مولانا يا علي العظيم، اللهم إنا نتوسل إليك أن تقسم لنا من خشيتك ما يحول بيننا وبين معاصيك، وأن تقسم لنا من رحمتك ما يقربنا من طاعتك، ونسألك يا رب أن ترزقنا من اليقين ما يهون علينا مصائب الدنيا وأحداثها وفتنها. لا إله إلا أنت. اللهم من هديت فلا مضل له، ومن يضللك فلا هادي له، إنك أنت العلي العظيم. Subhanallah, I'm always struck by the obligation and duty that all of us Muslims are keenly aware of, the duty to bear witness. And at the same time, I'm struck by the testimony that week after week comes from this podium. What is the role of witnessing? What is the function of witnessing? And what is the function of witnessing when you are in the midst of counter movements that are so massive, so overwhelming, that you fear that lonely voices will be submerged and overcome? But yet, in the same way that Allah has created human beings, and Allah has coded in their physical makeup the inevitability of breathing, the inevitability of breathing. And Allah, in fact, commanded human beings not to prevent themselves from breathing. In other words, not to kill themselves. What we often overlook is that witnessing, which is a product of freedom and liberty, is as natural and as inevitable and as coded in our DNA as breathing. Regardless of the consequences, regardless of the movement of history, regardless of how we assess the positives and the negatives and the balance of practicalities, the reality is that witnessing, which is, after all, in its essence, documenting what you perceive to be the truth and articulating in words your perception of truth and speaking it out. It is as natural and as physiologically necessary as the very act of breathing. Birds As you watch birds on trees, they testify and they witness throughout their existence. They witness through what is instinctively coded in them. Imagine if you can come to these birds and say, I will prevent you from witnessing. I will prevent you from acting upon that instinct that Allah has coded in you. Imagine silencing the birds. Animals naturally witness and testify. How often do I watch my dogs acting upon instinct? If a stranger comes close to the home, their testimony, their act of witnessing is to bark and to make a ruckus. If they are anxious, they testify. If they are scared, they testify. If they are hungry, they testify. If they are happy, they testify. They are constantly testifying according to the instinct that Allah has placed and coded within them. And I often imagine what it means if you come to these animals and you attempt to mute them. You attempt to act against that instinct in order to silence their testimony. SubhanAllah, Allah commanded us repeatedly, time and time and time again, to look at creation and reflect. And it is not so we can look and say Subhanallah and move on our merry way. It is to learn. And it is to learn some of the most basic lessons for what it means to be a created thing, for what it means to be a creature of Allah, a abd min ibadillah. All creation teaches us that it testifies according to what Allah has instinctively placed within them. Only human beings at least in the physical plane of things, because jinn is a different matter. But only human beings in our physical plane were given the power to act against instinct. We're given the power to negate what Allah has coded in them. Watch a baby. When a baby is born, a baby testifies. From the minute a child comes to this earth, their crying, their laughter, their baby sounds, all of that is testimony. All of that is witnessing. As natural and as necessary as the khutbah on this podium today. It is what Allah has coded in human instinct. If a baby is hungry and testifies by crying, and instead of feeding the baby, you attempt to silence the baby, you have acted against that instinct. But remarkably, human beings, how often human beings are driven by the impulse to regulate and control what they have no right to regulate and control. Yes, perhaps, maybe, we don't silence the birds, and we don't silence the dogs, and maybe we don't silence the lions, we don't silence the bears. Maybe, Allahu Alam. And maybe we don't silence the babies. And maybe we even recognize that to attempt to silence the babies is abuse. But most certainly, we learn to silence the full-grown adult. We learn to tell people, don't testify, don't witness, don't support the truth in your words. Learn to censor yourself. Learn to silence yourself. And is what is truly obscene is when we do that in the name of protecting God's religion and protecting God's message, when we act against God's coded instinct in creation in the name of defending God. I go back and I often reflect about how idiosyncratic, how eccentric, how much of an outlier the khutbahs that are articulated on this podium are, week after week after week. And I think about so much of the reality that goes on in our lives. So much of what plagues and affects Muslims every day in our lives. And it cannot be that you have this type of input, this type of impact, with this type of testimony, the testimony that you hear from the vast majority of podiums, the vast majority of time, without there being a thoroughly corrupting intervention between the events received and the ability to testify and what to testify about. When Muslims understood what it means to carry the covenant and burden and obligation of bearing witness on behalf of God, when that was what Muslims learned from their faith, when Muslims entered Persia, they encountered in Persia libraries that preserved the wisdom of the ancients. They could have done what the Byzantines did in Egypt. The Byzantines, having occupied Egypt for a long time, encountered the knowledge of the ancients in the library of Alexandria. And they burned that library to the ground. Because the church didn't see the utility in this massive library with its massive stocks, didn't see it as relevant to testifying for God or on behalf of God. After all, what is preserved in this library is the knowledge of people who never knew Jesus Christ and would never recognize Jesus Christ and would never accept being saved by Jesus Christ. And it was a straightforward matter. Although Western historians have gone to considerable lengths to obfuscate the issue of the responsibility as to who destroyed the Library of Alexandria, which was once upon a time the knowledge center of the world. In fact, it is clear Muslims encountered libraries of a massive scale in Persia. To the credit of the Persian Empire, as the Persians watched the Byzantines pursue ancient knowledge and destroy it, the Persians collected and protected and saved the texts of the ancients. And when Muslims came in contact with these libraries, if these Muslims were like the Muslims of today, who were not clear about what it means to testify for God or on behalf of God, well, even if they didn't destroy these libraries, they would have done what Muslims of today are so adept at doing. They would have simply ignored the libraries and allowed them to collect dust and to wither away without funds or care or preservation or translation. They would have simply said, these books, many of the texts preserved in Persia, by the way, were written in Greek. We don't read Greek. We don't know what the heck these books are saying. So who cares? We have the Quran. We have the Sunnah. Let's move on. But again, because Muslims don't write their history, and because Muslims are a colonized people, and because Muslims live under the hegemony of the other, that remarkable chapter in Islamic history is thoroughly ignored. What Muslims did, one, was that they were keen on preserving these ancient texts. Two, They asked the Persians and worked with the Persians and the Persian staff of translators and experts in Greek so that they can learn the necessary languages to read these texts. And they worked with the staff to further organize, systematize, and embrace and develop the processes of translation from Greek to Arabic. And it is these libraries in Persia that were at the heart of the birth of Muslim scholars like Kindi or Al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham. It is not a coincidence that many of these scholars were ethnically Persian. Although they mastered the Persian language, they also mastered the Arabic language. But you see, back then, it was understood that the more languages you learn, the more you are sincere and honest and effective in witnessing on behalf of God. And so it was not unusual for a Muslim scholar to master 4 and 5 and 6 languages. It was part of being a true servant of Allah. Imagine if the Muslims of the past were like the Muslims of today, and all they became concerned about is that these are Persians and we are Arabs. And we are different in ethnicities. And we cannot allow for the appearance that Persian culture has won over us. People willfully exist. People willfully ignore that without the ethnicities of the Caucasus, there would be no Bukhari, there would be no Muslim, there would be no Tirmidhi. People willfully ignore, without the ethnicities of the Caucasus and the Turks and the Persians, there would be no Kasani, there would be no Sarakhsi. In fact, 90% of those who are responsible for Islamic fiqh and Sharia, leave alone the sciences like medicine and optics and chemistry and algebra, wouldn't be. Muslims of today have accepted the biggest colonial trick on the books. Colonialism was intent on making Islam a desert religion, the religion of nothing but Arabia. All other articulations of Islam was seen as inauthentic and unreal. It is to shrink back Islam to the deserts of Arabia. But even worse this time, it wasn't the deserts of Hijaz, but the deserts of Najd. To shrink back Islam, this time, not to the deserts of Hijaz, but even worse, to the deserts of Najd. Why is it worse? Because Hijaz, at least historically, was a cosmopolitan cultural center. Najd was empty quarters, arid, and culturally impoverished. And they succeeded. They succeeded. And the Muslims of today don't have the wherewithal, the simple intellectual consciousness and presence to say Islam without the Turks never amounted to anything. Islam without the Persians never amounted to anything. Islam without Samarkand never amounted to anything. Islam without Africa never amounted to anything. Islam needs all its ethnicities, all its richness, all its diversity. That is our priority. No. Even those who convert to Islam take the easy way out. The easy way, easy money. The money that comes from the Islam of Arabia. Whether it's the money of the Saudis or the money of the Emiratis. And that type of Islam always wants Islam to be exotic and foreign. Not instinctive, not natural, not like the singing of birds on trees, not like the barking of dogs at strangers, nothing natural, but affectatious, fabricated, constructed, so that you are not testifying to what is a natural truth or the reality that surrounds you, but you are always testifying on a reality constructed by the power elite that controls petrodollars and that carefully engineers what they want Muslims to perceive as a reality. So the Islam of Arabia since 1985, that Islam, since 1985, in my lifetime, the Saudi government has destroyed The Saudi government has destroyed 98% of the Islamic historical sites in Arabia. 98%. The Islam of Arabia. Paris Hilton opened up a store in Mecca. So if the Prophet ﷺ comes back, he can stroll in the malls of Mecca and see the latest fashion that Paris Hilton is peddling in his city. The Islam of Arabia has turned our Mecca into a major commercial center for the rich and wealthy. Muslims encountered the massive libraries in Gandhi Shakur, in Persia. And what Muslims did jointly with the Persians, the Arabs at the time did was jointly with the Persians, with the libraries of Gandhi Shakur, was to build a lighthouse for the world. But the Muslims of our post-colonial world, with the family in power that the British placed in power, in the same way that the British made sure that Palestine is given to the Zionists, they also made sure that the Hijaz was given to Al Saud. Okay? So, I watched a video by A'id al-Qarni's son who escaped Saudi Arabia. And A'id al-Qarni's son is pleading with the world to save his father's life because his father just got sentenced to death. And the fact that A'id al-Qarni is sentenced to death is terrifying, because does this mean that Salman al-Auda is next? Does this mean that Hassan Farhan al-Maliki is next? Salih al-Talib, the Imam of Mecca, because he dared criticize the promiscuities that are taking place in Mecca, was promptly arrested. Abdullah Basfar, because he accepted an invitation to lead prayer or to visit the Mosque of Hagia Sophia, was sentenced to 12 years in prison. And then we read news like the following. A US citizen who visits Saudi Arabia on business, Saad Ibrahim al-Maddi, 72 years old, because he retweeted some tweets about Khashoggi and sent some tweets about human abuses in Saudi Arabia, is arrested and sentenced to 16 years in prison. And our government does nothing to secure his release. The man is 72 years old. He has to serve 16 years and then has a ban against flying out of Saudi Arabia for 16 years after he's released from prison. So it's clear he's going to die in prison. And we live in a world where the most natural thing, when you see this amount of ugliness associated with your most holy of holy, this is the space that all of us gravitate towards and look towards as Muslims. And it is a space that does not leverage justice or beauty. It leverages commercialism and vulgar, ugly, stark, dark injustices. Then you look at Muslims. Are they like the dogs that bark instinctively? Are they like the birds that chirp instinctively? No. These Muslims, the Muslims of today, are like Maulana Muhammad Tahir Mahmood Ashrafi from Pakistan, who, with the Pakistan Ulama Council and Ta'zim Haramain Sharifain Council, announces that it is un-Islamic to criticize Saudi Arabia or the Saudi leadership. And that is the duty and obligation of every Muslim to express solidarity with the Saudi government because they are the guardians of the two holy sites. It doesn't work that way. This is why Islamophobia exists. Because when the non-Muslim looks at Muslim quarters and wants to see what Muslims are conversing about, wants to see the impact of Islam upon Muslims, wants to see what this religion has done for its followers. Maybe they are racist and bigoted, but maybe if they see a positive impact of this religion upon its followers, maybe this will challenge their racism. But when they take a peek at Muslims, they find that they kill someone because she's not wearing her chador. They find that they are obsessing about whether women should cover their hair or not, and fighting battles over the bodies of women. They find that the guardians of their two holy sites are throwing people in prison left and right, executing people, brutalizing people, and Muslims don't even care. They find Muslims are far more interested if they're Arabs in demonizing Persians, and if they're Persians in demonizing Arabs, than they are in anything else. They don't find beauty. They don't find a breath of fresh air. They don't find light. And so they say, it must indeed be that this is a scary religion that does scary things to its people and its followers. That's the truth of the Prophet's pulpit. That's the truth that I will keep repeating until Allah takes my soul from this earth. That's the truth, whether anyone chooses to hear it or not. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم اسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى محمد يا رب العالمين. The truth if you lose conviction in the existence of truth, I assure you that there is no way that you can disbelieve in the possibility of truth and still believe in your objective self. The more our relationship to the truth is troubled and unstable, our relationship to our very self is troubled and unstable. The first thing that faith does in bringing light to the psychology of human beings is to tell them that there is truth, and that justice has a truth, and that compassion has a truth, and that mercy has a truth, and that beauty has a truth. And that truth might elude you at times. You might not be able to pinpoint it. You might not be able to anchor yourself upon it at times. But rest assured, it is there. And rest assured that it does have the power to stabilize you, to anchor you, and ultimately to free you. But like everything that is worthwhile in existence, all values demand to have its protectors, its knights, if you will. Those who stand up for the principle itself and sacrifice to uphold it. Nothing is more dangerous for theology, for the philosophy of religion, than a theology or a system of belief that tells you the truth is not worth defending, or do not worry about defending the truth. Just take care of your subjective self that is ultimately not anchored in any objective, truthful values. Nothing is more dangerous for a theology than a system of belief that comes and tells you, believe in God, but ultimately, God, when all is said and done, when it comes to values, is meaningless. How can God be meaningless if we do not understand the ways that God is an embodiment of the values of justice, mercy, compassion, beauty, honesty? Then what do you think our relationship to this God is going to look like? If what this God is about is some pedantic technical point of law, or pedantic technical points of law. But this God can watch a person go to prison for 12 years for a group of tweets, for chirping like birds on a branch, and has nothing to say about it. Or this God can watch a scholar like al-Qarni sentenced to death for saying Islam is justice and tyranny is bad, and has nothing to say about it. What do you think the relationship that can be constructed and built between a human being and this God? I will switch gears and focus on an example from a different perspective as my final point. People who work in the field, another field, where truth matters, and what truth you pursue and what truth you defend matters a great deal, is the field of international human rights. And I can tell you that in legal circles, in diplomatic circles, in law school circles, it is prestigious and celebrated if you, as a faculty member, for instance, you are chosen to work with the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. You are asked to be a reporter for the Human Rights Council or for the UN. You are celebrated. It is considered prestigious. It is considered a point of distinction. Look, our faculty are reporting on human rights issues for the UN. Well, this holds true, except for one truth. And that's when it comes to holding Israel accountable for its abuses. So, the UN Commission of Inquiry, a UN Commission of Inquiry created by the Human Rights Council. The Commission of Inquiry, of course, is constituted of distinguished law professors from different parts of the world. And they investigated rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip. And they recently released their second report calling on the Security Council to end Israel's permanent occupation and calling on the individual UN member states to prosecute Israeli officials for their human rights violations. In a 28-page report, which was presented October 27 to the General Assembly, this commission documented Israeli human rights violations of international law in the West Bank, the annexing of land by Palestinians in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Syrian Golan Heights. The report noted actions by Israel constituting de facto annexation include expropriating land and natural resources, establishing settlements and outposts, maintaining a restrictive and discriminatory planning and building regime for Palestinians, and extending Israeli law extraterritorially to Israeli settlers in the West Bank. Then the report accuses Israel of discriminatory policies against Arab citizens, of stealing natural resources, and of gender-based violence against Palestinian women. Not only that, but the report asked the International Court of Justice to issue an advisory opinion on the legal consequences of the continued refusal on part of Israel to end its occupation, and an investigation from the International Criminal Court prosecutor. It is a damning document, 28 pages, page after page, documenting a slew of human rights abuses. And that commission called upon the International Court of Justice to get involved and called upon the International Criminal Court to prosecute Israeli officials. Such a report on any other situation would be covered by law schools and international law human centers in law schools. Many law schools have centers that focus on human rights. And these centers simply gobble up everything that comes out of the Human Rights Council of the UN, and sponsors talks and lectures and publications But as you would expect, the response to the report was, of course, Zionist organizations called the drafters of the report anti-Semitic, and American law schools pretty much ignored the report, the second report, as they ignored the first. Because human rights matter, except when it comes to Israel. Racism is a problem, except when it comes to racism against Muslims. Now, it is easy to sit here and to say, this is unfair, it shouldn't be. But you pause for a second. The truth of the matter is, it is the systematic and persistent, clear-visioned activism of Zionist organizations that constantly obfuscate the truth about Israeli human rights abuses and Israeli racism. It is the commitment of young-aged college students, law school students, Jewish businesses, the funding of activism that constantly says, yeah, well, the Human Rights Council can talk about anything, and what it says can be considered a matter of prestige and a matter of great interest, except when it comes to Israel. But then you look around, and as this report comes out, you read the news that the United Arab Emirates has concluded a military defense deal with Israel, that Google has concluded a major project with Israel, that Saudi Arabia is progressing or going ahead with the Neom project, that no Muslim country, and really very few Muslim groups, maybe CARE is the only exception in the United States, that have even read the 28-page report and question. The level of activism by Muslims about issues that they should care about. It is suffice to say that Muslims will get more worked up about hijab than they will be about the racist apartheid system against Palestinians in effect in Israel. And that message was heard wide and clear by the Chinese against the Uyghurs, by the Indians against the Kashmiris and against other Muslim Indians, leave alone by the Burmese against the Rohingyas. But even recently, who knows about the new Danish laws that further discriminate against Muslims? Who knows about the new Swiss laws that further discriminate and in fact fine Muslims for wearing the burqa? Truth needs its heroes. That's as simple as it is. Are you personally willing to be a hero for truth? Or are you just an observer? Then don't complain when you see truth brutalized all around you and violated and stomped on and degraded because you failed to be a hero in upholding truth and defending truth. Last point. There's current litigation. Arkansas, one of the states, in a number of states, about 15 states, passed laws that require anyone that does business with the state to sign an affirmation that they will not boycott Israel. Although, why should that matter for a state? But that's the way it is. And Arkansas is one of these states that passed an anti-boycott law, anti-Israeli boycott law. If you want to do business with the state of Arkansas, including be employed as maybe a school teacher or a university professor in Arkansas, you have to sign a document that you will not support a boycott of Israel and that you will not support a business that boycotts Israel. That law has been challenged repeatedly in different states, and different courts have struck down the law as unconstitutional, except that in Arkansas, a Trump appointee, a judge who's a Trump appointee, upheld the law. It is being challenged by the ACLU. A Trump appointee upheld the law, and now the law is being appealed to the US Supreme Court, which is a court unfortunately dominated by Trump appointees. I am not optimistic about what the Supreme Court is going to do with this law. But do you see, for all of you that sit there and say, Professor, why do you pick on Zaytuna? Why do you pick on Hamza Yusuf? So what if the faculty in Zaytuna supported Trump? So what if Hamza Yusuf is wishy-washy about this or that? It's not that bad. After all, they love Islam and they're Muslim brothers. Do you see the price of apathy? the Supreme Court that held the Muslim ban, and the folks, so many Muslims, were not outraged. It wasn't a turning point in their life. Now, when this law is upheld, and I think it will be upheld by the Supreme Court, do you know what that means in terms of setting a precedent? That if you as a Muslim want to get a state job, a state contract, you have to affirm things that might be against your liberty. And if Muslims themselves don't value their liberty, don't value being like the birds that chirp on the branches of a tree, or like the dogs that bark at a stranger, they don't value that. They don't understand what it means to defend the right to do that. Then why should anyone value it for you? أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إني داع فأمنوا اللهم اغفر لنا اللهم اعف عنا اللهم ارحمنا اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا علي يا عظيم. Allah forgive our sins. Allah guide us towards the straight path. Allah allow us to see and defend and be heroes for the truth as you have demanded and as you have coded within our genes. Ya Ali Ya Azim. Allow us to live up to the promise of Islam as the face of light and justice and truth. Ya Rabbal Alameen. Wa salli wa sallim wa barik ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa aqim as-salah.